What's up YouTube? This is John Helm with Helm, Woodshop, and Smithy back with another knife making video. Today, how to make knife scales from a piece of firewood. Knife making's dirty little secret is that you'll spend way more money on abrasives and handle materials than you will steel. Even if you buy expensive steel from the mill, it's still relatively cheap. But stabilized wood handles, micarta, handle liners, pins, all those things are very expensive. You could easily spend 50 bucks making a cool looking handle for a knife. So if you're doing it on a budget or you're trying to sell knives and turn a profit on them, the best thing that you can do if you have the time and the tools available to you is to try and make your own. I've tried making micarta in the past. I wouldn't really recommend making micarta at home because it's just a huge sticky mess and it never turns out as good as the stuff that you get from a professional supplier. But stabilized wood scales can easily be made at home because the quality of the wood is determined by how the tree was grown and the species, not necessarily by how you make it. You really just need to be able to cut it up into size and then stabilize it. I live in North Texas, so majority of the firewood I find around here is red oak. Now red oak isn't really the coolest wood. It's kind of boring looking. It does have some redeeming qualities. It is super tough, it's very flexible, it's relatively easy to work with, but it usually doesn't have any cool figuring or anything like that. It's just kind of, it just looks like wood. But a lot of the time you can get lucky. They don't store the wood in the best conditions ever, especially if you go to a place to buy it and you didn't split it up yourself. So frequently you'll find pieces with spalting on them, and when red oak is spalted, it is beautiful. Yesterday I went down to Tractor Supply to grab a few things and they had firewood for sale. It was Thanksgiving. I thought it'd be nice to have the fireplace going, so I picked up a few bags and I found 2 logs that look like they could have some good spalting in it. So let's get them open and see what we have. Now if you're looking at a stack of firewood, you can usually identify the pieces that could potentially be spalted by this black color along the side. And even more frequently than that, I'll see black here on the ends of the logs. I also have this tree trunk from a red plum tree that I had to cut down in my backyard because it died. Now if you look at the outside of it, it has a really strange growth pattern. It doesn't appear to be a burl. It looks like the tree was diseased, which makes sense because it died when it was only 4 or 5 years old. However, this weird growth pattern may have resulted in some cool twisty looking grain. I'm hoping that it did, and hopefully we can get some cool scales out of this piece as well. Start with this big piece of potentially spalted red oak. Now when you have a really big chunk of wood like this, and I'm assuming that you don't own a wood mill, it can be really difficult to get the surfaces flat enough that it's safe to put in your miter saw or especially on your table saw. You definitely don't want to get kickback. In order to do that, you need to have 2 flat sides. And for that reason, I recommend cutting it in like 6 or 7 inch sections before you start milling it out. Maybe not spalted, but we're definitely going to have some cool colors in there. I'll go ahead and cut up this chunk of plum wood while I have the miter saw out. So cutting pieces of lumber that aren't squared up in your miter saw can be very dangerous. I do it a lot. I know it's risky. I probably shouldn't do it, but I don't have a joiner to get it squared up before I put it on there. So one thing to keep in mind is you definitely do not want to put it in such a way that when you're done cutting it, the pieces are going to fall in towards the blade. That's when it grips it, that's when it flies back, hits your fence. It can destroy the fence on your miter saw. Also, it's a really easy way to lose a finger, break a finger, lose a fingernail. So you got to be very careful. I always try to make sure that it is sitting on the base of the saw right underneath the saw blade where the cut is being made, and that it's not touching on the sides. If that happens, when you cut it in half, it will fall away from the blade and I don't have to worry about it binding up. Now this one, there was no way to set it that way. So I cut it most of the way through, and I'm going to finish it up with a hand saw. just to be safe. So here are all our pieces of wood after they've been cut into roughly 6-inch sections. The next goal that we have is to kind of quarter these, or at least have two sides that are flat and right next to each other so it's safe to stick through on a table saw. If you have a band saw, you can just go ahead and start cutting these, but I know that most people don't have band saws. So we're gonna have to split these in half, and there are a few different methods that I like to use. If you are lucky enough to get your hands on some firewood that is actually properly dried, you can just split it right in half with a hatchet or an axe. It's usually not hard at all to split, even if it's a really tough species of wood like red oak. You just give it one good whack, and it usually falls right in half for you. However, even firewood, which should obviously be dry since you intend on burning it, it usually isn't dried very well. If you ever bought some firewood at a gas station or something, you know what I'm talking about. You put it on top of the fire and all you hear is that psss, sizzling sound of all the water escaping from the wood grain. So trying to split a wet piece of wood with an axe or a hatchet, it's not going to work out well for you. You might eventually be able to get it split, especially if you have like a heavy maul or a splitting wedge you can pound in with a sledgehammer. But in that case, I usually saw it rather than split it. And sawing has the added benefit that you have a perfectly clean edge. You don't have to clean it up afterwards at all unless you have an uneven cut. And even then, it's usually just a couple swipes with a hand planer, you're ready to go. But another way that you can go is if you have a bottom cutting tool on your anvil, you can stick it in a vise or on your anvil, put your piece of wood on top of it and whack it with a hammer. This is probably the most accurate way because you don't really have to aim your axe. It's really difficult, especially if you're splitting a big piece with a big long axe, to hit it right square in the middle. A lot of times you'll hit it off to the side, and well, you can still get a flat edge that way. If it's a big piece, you really want to try and break it down as much as possible. So let's head over to the anvil. I'll split a couple of these. I don't have any pieces here that appear to be dry enough to split with a hatchet. So we're just going to split them on the anvil. The other pieces we'll saw, and I'll show you how both those work. So if you have a chisel like I do, you'll notice that I only have about an inch of clearance in between the top of the chisel and the face of my anvil. And because of that, this wedge doesn't extend up far enough to split most pieces of wood except for the most splintery, dry pieces. So for that reason, I usually use it in my leg vise when I'm doing this. If you happen to have a bottom cutting chisel that is taller than mine, this won't be much of an issue. Also, I've seen some of these that were made out of a large piece of round stock, so they have a pretty pronounced taper on them. Those work really well because it's shaped just like a splitting maul. It drives the two halves apart from one another and it splits them really easily. But because I don't have one of those, we're gonna do this in the leg vise. If you have a piece that's already started to split like this one here, try to split it right along that edge where it's already split. If you try to split it another way, you might be able to get it to go, but then you're gonna have cracks in the pieces of wood that you're trying to mill out, and that's no good. I've never tried to do a piece of wood this big with this little chisel, so let's just see how it goes. This wood isn't quite as dry as I would like it to be for splitting. It's not quite long enough for this piece, so I'm going to get at it from the other side as well. There we go. Now this piece of plum wood has that really weird twisty grain, so splitting this with an axe or with a chisel would be a really bad idea. It's likely not to go the way that you want it to. So I'm gonna saw this one down the middle and then we'll finish cutting it on the table saw. So you can see on this piece of wood how the wood on the outside isn't attached to the center very well. It splits right off and I can see the gap when I press on it like this. So I really don't think that this piece of wood is going to make a very good handle scale, which is unfortunate because cutting it in half was a big pain in the ass. So let's get working on the other pieces. For this piece of red oak, all I really need to do, since it was already quartered, is shave these down so they're flat. So you can see they used one of those hydraulic log splitters. that have teeth on it, so it puts these big ridges in it. Those are relatively easy to get off. I'll just do it with a fat chisel, and then I'll hit it up with a hand plane to make sure it's nice and flat. Now keep in mind when you're doing this that this doesn't have to be perfect. It just can't get all cattywampus on you, because that will cause it to bind up if you put it through a table saw. So I'm not going to plane this thing perfectly smooth and beautiful. I'm just going to get it so that it's relatively flat. And I don't have to worry about it tipping or catching on anything while we're cutting it. All right, that looks good. Time to get the other side. Now, if you have access to one, by far the best way to do this is with a joiner. It will give you a perfectly flat side. Then when you go to do the second side, it will be 90 degrees exactly to the first side. And that's ideal, that's what we're aiming for. But most people don't have those. I used to have one, but it was a piece of garbage. It was a little cheap one. I have a buddy who has a really nice one, but he lives across town. All right, I got those two pieces flattened off on the sides. This is hard work, man. Pushing a plane and a chisel, removing this much material to get it smooth, it's no easy task. That's why I do woodworking 4 days a week. Pretty wood. It's gonna make some nice looking scales. So the first few cuts that I make on the table saw, I'm just gonna try to turn this into a recognizable square or rectangular shape from which I can measure and mill out all of my other scales. So first I'll just take this edge off. You'll notice I shaved off all 4 sides, even though I already had 2 sides relatively flat from planing. The reason I did that is because now, not only do all the sides run parallel with one another, but they're all at 90-degree angles. This is really important when you're going to cut your scales out, because if you want to rip off a really thin piece, like we're going to be doing, it's going to be, most scales are between 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch thick. If you don't have a perfectly even piece of wood, you're going to have a really hard time getting even flat scales cut off of it. So make sure that it's square first, then set your table saw to the appropriate width and rip them off. All right, well, I got the oak and the plum milled down, and they are particularly good looking pieces of wood. Both species of them came out quite well. They have some nice patterning, good colors in there, and they're both very solid, strong woods. Any wood that you get from a fruit tree is going to be outstanding, especially plums, peaches, apples. All those kinds of wood are great. Figs, also, the wood from fig trees is great. It's also really good for smoking in your smoker if you have some left over. But when you're cutting these on a table saw, as you could see on my little 10-inch table saw, that the blade was all the way up as high as it could go because of the thickness of the wood. And that can cause an issue. When you have the blade extending all the way, it'll have a tendency to cant off to the side. So you'll have one edge of your wood that's a little bit thicker than the other, but it's usually not that bad. On my saw, I use a thin curved blade, which will kind of accentuate that issue. And it's usually off by about 1/32 of an inch, which that's not a problem at all. Anyway, these, you can feel the moisture in them. They're still very, very wet. So I'm gonna have to lay these out so that they can dry before I'm able to stabilize them, which sucks. Everybody hates waiting for wood to dry because it takes forever. But when you mill it up first, the likelihood of it splitting as it dries is drastically decreased. And also the amount of time that it has to sit before it gets dry drastically decreases. If you have a piece of wood this big around, 4 or 5 inches thick, you can expect it to take at least 2 years before it's dry, and that would be under ideal conditions where it's warm and dry year round. In most parts of the United States, you can expect to wait about a year per inch of thickness. So that would be 5 years. Screw that. This 3/8 of an inch, it's probably, if you let it sit in your garage for one summer in Texas, it's gonna be bone dry. You can also dry your wood out in the oven by setting it to the lowest setting possible, propping the door open a little bit and just sticking them on the rack. Or you can stick them in a dehydrator like you would use to make beef jerky. I do this sometimes when I'm in a rush, but there is a big drawback to it, and that is that your wood is much more likely to split or warp while it is drying. Definitely the best way to dry your wood is to mill it into boards and stack them on top of each other with little sticks in between. That way the weight of the wood presses down and keeps them nice and flat, but they still have a little bit of airspace in between them for the moisture to escape and evaporate out into the atmosphere around it. You can mimic this inside of your fruit dehydrator though, and I'm gonna show you how to do that. Of course, the first thing that you're gonna need before you can stick and stack your wood are a bunch of little sticks. I usually just take a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and run it through on the table saw so it's about 1/4 of an inch thick or so, and then we'll use those for the sticks before we put this into the dehydrator. This process is relatively simple. You do exactly what it sounds like. You're just gonna put a piece of wood, put some sticks, and stack. Once they're stacked up, we'll tip it on its side, stick some clamps on it. Make sure you remove the plastic stoppers on your clamps. You don't want them to melt in the dehydrator. Couple things to keep in mind when you're using this method. You want to use pretty light clamping pressure. You want it just a little bit firm. You don't want things scooting around. You want to keep them all held in place, but at the same time, you don't want to go off damaging your wood. Another thing is that your clamps need to be in line with the row of sticks. If they are in the middle, the top and bottom pieces of wood are going to be warped, and if they're too far on the outside, the top and bottom pieces of wood are going to be warped. So just don't make that mistake. But now these are stacked, they are stuck, and they are clamped. So they're ready to go into the dehydrator. I like to do it for about 12 hours and I don't know, I'd say 120, 130 degrees. Anyway, enough blabbering. I'm gonna go chunk these in the dehydrator. I'll see you in 12 hours. All right, y'all, it's been 12 hours and went ahead and got these out of the dehydrator. Let's take a look at them. Here is the wood straight out of the dehydrator. I ran it for 12 hours at 128 degrees because for some reason my dehydrator changes temperatures in really strange increments. But they look great, especially this wood from the plum tree. It has beautiful grain and colors to it. It's gonna look really nice, especially after you have an oil finish on it. I did run into an issue that I don't generally run into, and that is this amount of cupping that I got, particularly on the pieces of plum wood. Now, some amount of cupping is pretty much unavoidable. You're gonna have a little bit of a twist, maybe a little split or two here and there when you dry wood quickly. That just comes with the territory. But this is much more pronounced than it generally is, and I know why it happened, and I know what to do to avoid it next time. Usually when I put wood into the dehydrator to get it ready for stabilization, it's really just a technicality. The wood has been sitting in my garage for a long time or in a store or wherever else it may be, and it is pretty much dry. I'm just putting it in the dehydrator to make sure that there's no moisture left in it so we can get the best stabilization possible. These pieces were so wet that you could feel the dampness when you touch them with your fingers. So when I put them in the dehydrator and clamped them up, they were initially nice and snug. They were going to stay pretty flat while they were drying out. But as the water evaporated out of them, they lost a lot of volume. So when I went and got them out of the dehydrator, the clamps were no longer tight at all. They weren't applying any pressure. There was actually about 1/8 of an inch gap in between the clamp, and the piece of wood. So in the future, what I'll do, especially if I have a piece of wood that I know is really wet, is I'll go back every hour or two and tighten up those clamps, make sure that we still have the pressure on them while they are drying out so that we don't get excessive cupping. But in any event, this was still a successful endeavor. I just need to flatten these out a little bit, and after that, we'll still have plenty of meat left to make some nice handle scales out of them. I will go ahead and stabilize these before I bother flattening them out, and that's because they're gonna be absorbing moisture and then once again drying. And so having a little bit more warping or cupping is a possibility. I already have a video on wood stabilization, and I've been doing some experiments trying to perfect my at-home method. And so I'll probably be making another video on that in the future. So I'm not gonna do that in this video. That is all for today. Thank you all very much for joining me once again. And don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Y'all have a good one.